everyone. Today I'm going to be discussing the need to reduce meat consumption. Albert Einstein once said, "Nothing will benefit human health and increase the chances for survival of life on Earth as much as the evolution to a vegetarian diet." The growing issue of climate change and global warming has a great impact on us now and what the future will look like. After I learned about the effects the meat industry has on the environment, I decided to become a vegetarian. That was almost 3 years ago, and I have never looked back. Overall, the importance of this speech is to move away from a heavy meat diet to combat the effects of climate change. For my first point, I will cover the percentage of emissions released from the meat industry and their effects. Next, I will discuss alternatives and meat substitutes. Lastly, I will cover how beneficial it is to source from local foods instead of factory farms. Jumping right into my speech, I will cover my first point. To start, I will discuss the rate of emissions released from the meat industry and how it contributes to climate change. The meat industry releases a great amount of greenhouse gas emissions, which results in the warming of the planet. Research from the Food and Agricultural Organization of the UN shows that emissions from livestock account for about 14.5% of the total greenhouse gas emissions. From this study, we can also see that globally, roughly 2/3 of those emissions come from cattle, these being methane burped from cows, growing feed and clearing land for grazing, and feed crops. These studies have shown that emissions and the contribution of the meat industry are lower than what I just mentioned, but those studies do not take into account the land use and water use that affects emission levels as well, which this study had. After looking at the research, we can see that emissions released from the meat industry are contributing to a large chunk of total greenhouse gas emissions. Most of these emissions are coming from cattle, or specifically the red meat industry, which is why there needs to be an adjustment in how much we consume of these types of meat specifically. After looking at the greenhouse gas emissions, our diets need to evolve, which means cutting out portions of meat and looking at substitutes and alternatives to meat. I want to assess what meat alternatives there are to move away from a dense and heavy meat diet. In recent years, there has been a rise in plant-based and vegan options and alternatives to meat. There has been a surge in brands such as Impossible Foods and Beyond Meat, which practically mimic the taste and look of meat. In the video I'm about to show you, it's an ad for Burger King, and they're promoting their new burger from Impossible Foods, and they're showing real people's reactions to the taste of it.
This Whopper has no beef.
That's impossible. This tastes just like a classic Whopper. No beef.
Introducing the Impossible Whopper with a patty made from plants.
I'm sorry? Tastes just like a Whopper.
I've never had plant taste like beef before.
Tastes like a Whopper. Tastes like a Whopper. Tastes like a beef burger.
Like, I can't believe that was not beef. Lies!
100% Whopper and 0% beef. The Impossible Whopper, only at Burger King.
I'm confused. I'm reevaluating my life.
As you can see in the video, many people were very shocked by how close and how much it resembled a normal burger. This is just moving the strides towards evolving and reducing our meat consumption. There are also other alternatives to having meat that isn't a substitute that is still enriched with protein, which can be a concern for many when looking towards eating less meat. Research from the World Resources Institute shows beef requires 20 times more land, emits 20 times more GHG emissions per gram of edible protein than common plants such as beans. This research provides that beans can be a great alternative to eating meat, and then the land use causes more emissions to be produced when trying to obtain beef, and this is why alternatives that use less land and water can be beneficial to reducing emissions and combat climate change, like you saw with the beans. These alternatives can help people reduce their meat intake and move away from the reliance on meat for protein in our diet. Now that we've looked at some of the alternatives, I want to cover how local farms are great options for sourcing foods and meat instead of factory or industrialized farming. Lastly, I will cover how switching from the industrial or factory farm to locally sourcing livestock and vegetables from farms reduces greenhouse gas emissions. To reduce emissions, we need to reduce meat consumption. This means assessing when we do decide to eat meat on occasions, where should we be sourcing it from? In this article, Green Dreams, promoting urban agricultural and the availability of locally produced food in the Vancouver area. Broadway discusses the changes being made in Vancouver to help climate change and support local businesses. Urban planners have promoted strategies that encourage the consumption of locally produced food to reduce greenhouse gas emissions and reduce pollution and improve urban dwellers' access to fresh fruit and vegetables. In this piece, we see the push and switch towards sourcing locally for food. By using fresh local foods and livestock, they have been able to cut emissions through farming practices and reducing waste. In another research piece, Global Farming, Animal Protection, and Global Warming, by the authors Cons Warren and Nierenberg, back this idea when they discuss how harmful industrial and factory farming land practices can be. Landless facilities tend to produce more manure than can be used as fertilizer on nearby cropland. Manure is instead distributed to a small local land mass, resulting in soil accumulation and runoff of phosphorus, nitrogen, and other pollutants. The manure produced from industrial livestock facilities greatly affects the large aspect of greenhouse gas emissions released from producing meat, which can also be reduced with smaller local farms that reduce the demand of meat for their communities, just like you saw in the article in Vancouver. So overall, to reiterate my first point, discuss the impact that meat industry has on climate change. Secondly, I reviewed meat alternatives and substitutes to help ensure a transition for people to reduce their meat intake. Finally, my last point covered the benefits of switching from sourcing industrial farming to sourcing food from local farms. Finally, my last point covered the benefits. This speech addresses why and how we can reduce our meat consumption to fight climate change. In conclusion, next time you go to the grocery store or go out to dinner, I want you to consider not purchasing meat or looking at options without meat. This does not have to be a full change, but each one can make a small change by having a meal without meat once a day, or having a day where you just don't have meat at all. Even a small change in our meat consumption can make a big difference, or even a small difference in our environment when we all come together to reduce our meat intake.